Oh dear. Another day, another gun massacre. Well, there are those who say that it's wrong to politicize tragedies or atrocities, as I prefer to call them, such as yesterday's gun massacre in Oregon. But I don't really agree. I don't agree with those voices who tend to be pro-gun rights voices. I don't agree with that critique because I think that these atrocities do raise very important and legitimate public policy issues. So I don't think that President Obama or other gun control advocates are unduly politicizing this issue. Along those lines, I thought this was as good a time as any to explain my own stance on the principled dimension of the issue of gun control. You've heard me say many a time that I consider myself a libertarian, albeit a very realist and pragmatic sort of libertarian, one who leans toward the political center. My libertarianism, as I'm fond of putting it, is a compass, not a straitjacket. I don't feel that it locks me into, any particular policy positions with absolute rigidity. And my stance on the issue of gun control is one example of that. So let me explain why I think it's not at all self-contradictory for this libertarian to support certain forms of gun control as a matter of principle. Practical, logistical issues aside. My libertarianism is a product of the no harm principle that was propounded by the British philosopher John Stuart Mill in the 19th century in his book On Liberty. Now that principle, in a nutshell of course, holds that people should be free to do as they choose without government intervention or coercion as long as they are not harming others. That's not necessarily the premise from which all or even most libertarians operate, but it is my premise. Now, given that premise, I think it makes sense to say that gun control, if it's done right, and if it's not taken too far, actually can be justified in principle, even from a libertarian perspective. The reason is the inherent nature of guns themselves. Firearms are obviously weapons, and deadly weapons at that. They are instruments of harm. They are tools that by their very nature and design are intended to enable their users to do harm. So, frankly, I think it makes perfect sense, even from a libertarian perspective, to say there has to be some room for the government, and of course, I'm not an anarchist. I'm not one of the anarcho-capitalist libertarians out there. I'm one of those who think that there needs to be government and that government has a number of legitimate and necessary functions. Prime and chief among them being, the function and the purpose of keeping people safe, safeguarding public health and safety. When you're talking about firearms, given that these are instruments of harm, of injury, and of course, potentially of death, I think it makes perfect sense to say there need to be some rules and regulations in place, at least to keep these instruments out of the hands of criminals. So that's the basic principled premise that leads me to believe that gun control, done correctly, can be reconciled with libertarian principles. But let me make one thing clear. When I talk about gun control that I think is justifiable from a libertarian perspective, I'm not talking about gun prohibition. I'm opposed to gun prohibition. I'm opposed to any policy whereby the government would seek to prohibit the private legal ownership of guns by law-abiding citizens. I'm opposed to it because I believe very strongly in the principle of self-defense. Now, a few years ago, when I was in law school, in a public speaking competition in which I participated during my final year of law school, I actually got to address this issue in a bit of depth. Check this out. Individuals have the right to fight back against violent attackers to protect their own safety and, in many cases, their very survival. I would submit to you that in the dangerous world that we inhabit, and I know this is a controversial position, there are few more fundamental rights that a person can exercise than the right of self-preservation. As a practical matter, law enforcement is all too often unable and sometimes even unwilling, to arrive on the scene in time to save the day. As a matter of principle, free men and women should not have to entrust their very survival and security to the state. As you can hear from that clip, I actually do believe very sincerely that free men and women in a free society should be able to access firearms for the purpose of self-defense. And I don't think that that is an outlandish or extreme position at all. I think that it's, frankly, morally obtuse to suggest that people should be forced to rely exclusively on the government, on the state, on law enforcement, in other words, for their safety and survival. Access to firearms is particularly important for people who are not physically very strong or prepossessing or athletic or agile, whose martial skills are not very advanced, or people who are simply, small of stature, people who are more vulnerable, maybe they have disabilities, what have you. I think people like that, who are often obviously targets for violent criminals, should be able to access firearms to defend themselves. Now, let me make clear that I'm not necessarily talking about, the right to bear arms that's enshrined in the U.S. Constitution specifically. That's a debate for another day, in my view. But, even if the Second Amendment didn't exist in U.S. constitutional law, for example, I would still support the right to bear arms for self-defense as a political matter. And that's really the sort of lens through which I'm looking at this issue right now. However, I should also point out, and this is where I'm going to get myself into trouble with a lot of libertarians and conservatives out there, I actually don't subscribe to the idea that it's the last defense against tyranny. I don't think it's realistic, especially in the United States particularly, to pretend that private gun ownership is going to be an effective bulwark against tyranny. The idea sounds very compelling in theory, at least to a lot of people, but it actually doesn't hold water for me. I don't believe that private gun ownership prevents governments in the United States from becoming too repressive. First of all, obviously there have been many cases throughout American history in which governments did become repressive, and private gun ownership doesn't seem to have prevented that from happening. Now, mind you, I think part of the reason is that American governments never become tyrannical across the board. They don't oppress the entire civilian population of the country, or even of particular states or localities, on an aggregate basis. They tend to target certain slices of the population, usually minority groups, disfavored minority groups, for repression. And as a result, you have the mainstream of the civilian population either sitting still for that repression or even supporting it, whether it's the repression of racial minorities like African Americans or Native Americans, or of women, or of religious minorities, or what have you. There are other reasons I don't buy it as well. For one thing, a government as powerful, with as much firepower as the U.S. government, is only going to respond to widespread gun ownership by civilians by ratcheting up its own firepower, its own arsenal. And a government with the resources that the U.S. government has at its disposal will always be able to win any arms race against the civilian population, particularly since there are always going to be many Americans who simply decline to purchase firearms. What's more, it takes a lot more than just an armed population to successfully resist a powerful, determined government. Now, I've had this argument with a lot of my fellow libertarians in the past, and they've brought up historical examples such as, the Mujahideen resistance to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in the 1980s. I had to point out to them, look, those were very different circumstances than what would prevail if the American people rose up against a tyrannical American government. In Afghanistan in the 80s, or in Vietnam in the 60s and 70s, for example, you had interventions by foreign imperial powers, the US in Vietnam and the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. They were intervening in foreign countries with cultures that were alien to them, that they didn't fully understand, where religions were practiced that they didn't relate to, languages were spoken that they didn't speak, and so on. And so the insurgents in those conflicts had the home court advantage. In addition to that, those insurgents benefited from outside support. The Viet Cong was supported by the North Vietnamese and by the Soviet Union and Communist China during the Vietnam War. during the Soviet war in Afghanistan in the 1980s, the Mujahideen were actually on their ropes in the early stages of the conflict until the U.S. intervened and started using the CIA to funnel arms and training to the Mujahideen. From what I've read, the provision of shoulder-mounted surface-to-air missile launchers, Stinger missile launchers, were particularly instrumental in turning the tide of the war because those enabled the Mujahideen to fight back effectively against the Russians' helicopter gunships. So, that would be a very different circumstance than what would prevail in the event of a popular armed uprising in the United States. The U.S. government would have the same home court advantage that a homegrown insurgency would have. They would have much more firepower, much better training, several levels of law enforcement from which to benefit. Like I said earlier, American governments are never uniformly tyrannical. They only tend to, become repressive in a piecemeal manner. And so you would have many mainstream Americans who would not want to have anything to do with the insurgency. And that's another tool that insurgencies tend to use. They tend to use support from the civilian population to successfully resist the invader or what have you. But if much of the civilian population refuses to get involved and is, in many cases, actively supporting the army that you're resisting, the insurgency is probably not going to succeed. And look, at the end of the day, we're talking about America, right? A country with a very well-developed, advanced, sophisticated system of government that enables ordinary people to use peaceful avenues to fight back against government violations of their rights and freedoms. You have the political process, which is notoriously unreliable, but you also have the judicial process. You have all of these peaceful means at your disposal of resisting government tyranny. I just don't see American governments ever becoming so oppressive that armed rebellion is ever necessary. And I just don't see it being very likely to succeed either. So, for all those reasons, I support private gun ownership. I think that it's just in principle. I think it makes sense to allow law-abiding citizens that means of defending themselves against violent crime. And as I pointed out in that same public speaking competition in law school that I mentioned earlier, I think that private gun ownership and reasonable gun regulation complement each other because they both aim to really give ordinary people, law-abiding citizens, a fighting chance against the criminal element out there, right? Gun control aims to keep guns out of the hands of criminals in the first place, and armed self-defense gives law-abiding citizens a fighting chance, literally as well as figuratively, against violent criminals who target them when they do manage to get their hands on guns, despite the government's best efforts to prevent them from doing so. So, I agree that people have a right to bear arms as a matter of moral principle, if, leaving the constitutional issue off the table for the time being. But that right isn't absolute. As with pretty much all other rights, there are limits to it. And I think that those limits can be respected and captured properly by reasonable gun control. Now, exactly what form reasonable gun control should take is open to conjecture, and that's a topic for another day. But I just thought I would share my thoughts with you as to why this libertarian supports some gun control.